Jesus said, I am the good shepherd, and those of my sheep follow me because they know my voice. I want to begin with a question for you today. What does the voice of Jesus sound like to you today? What does the voice of the Good Shepherd sound like to you here amidst this COVID-19 pandemic, in this day and age where people are faced with a really difficult choice between their lives and their livelihood, the stress of staying hunkered down or opening up? What does the voice of the Good Shepherd sound like to you today? If you're a person whose heart is broken, whose shoulders are rounded and you are hunched over because you carry a weight of grief or sadness or anxiety, I imagine that the voice of the Good Shepherd might sound like the voice of comfort right now. Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. If you're a person whose heart is empty and longing for meaning or direction, I imagine the voice of the Good Shepherd might sound like the voice of purpose or the voice of conviction. Pick up the cross and follow me, says the Good Shepherd. If you're one whose heart is in a cage right now, or better yet, if you are one who feels like you are on the outside of the gate, always looking in, shut out by the voices and powers of injustice and unrighteousness, the voice of the Good Shepherd might sound to you a little bit like a key turning in the lock of an old rusted padlock, and the rusty chains of injustice clanking to the ground, and an old rusted gate creaking open. Come unto me, said Jesus. I have a place for you. I am the gate, said Jesus. And my sheep can enter through the gate and find safety, and go back into the world and find pasture. I have come as the gate that they might have life and that they might have it in abundance. What's the voice of the Good Shepherd sound like to you these days? I wonder if it sounds like that old creaking gate to you, opening up, creating a space, a safe space, a welcome for you, that you might be nourished and strengthened in your faith, and then so that you could be sent back into the world to proclaim God's good news, the grace, the amazing grace of God, and the good news of our risen Savior. I hope the voice of the Good Shepherd sounds a little bit like that to you. It sort of sounds like church in some ways, doesn't it? We come in and we find safety and renewal and strength where our faith is fed. We come in and find safety, then we go back out through the gate into the world where we have pasture, where we can live our lives in faith, and we can be serving and proclaiming the gospel, and we can be living the life in abundance. I want to share a story with you I heard this past week and was quite moved by. A true story. It's the story of a young woman, really a schoolgirl, who moved from Mississippi to Atlanta, Georgia with her parents. Her mother and her father both were feeling called to become pastors, and so they went to Emory University to study to become Methodist pastors. Their daughter, the schoolgirl, who's all grown up now, said, apparently my parents weren't satisfied just being Mississippi poor. They needed to be Methodist pastor poor. And so they packed up everything, moved to Atlanta, and they moved into kind of a tough neighborhood. This schoolgirl went to high school at a very challenged high school. 99% of the student body at the school she went to is what we call minority student body. It was a difficult place to learn. And yet this schoolgirl worked hard. She worked extra hard. She gave it all she had because she wanted to succeed in life. She wanted to do well. Well, her parents were also studying in seminary. And she went to church on Sundays, and she learned her scriptures, and she heard the story of the Good Shepherd many, many times over. She heard the story of the gate that has been opened up to the least of these. The least of these among us. The gate has been opened that they might come in and find safety, and might go out and find pasture, and they might live the life abundant in Jesus Christ. She gave everything she had. She devoted everything she had to succeeding throughout her high school career, and it paid off. When she graduated, she was elected as the valedictorian of her graduating class. What an honor! Now, if you're from Georgia, you know that if you get elected valedictorian of your graduating class, you get to go to the governor's mansion in Atlanta. There's a wonderful little reception, and you get to meet the governor, get your photo taken with the governor. I was thinking that my daughter, a number of years ago, was elected valedictorian when she graduated from the Savannah Arts Academy. And we got in my shiny metallic blue sports car, and we zipped over to Atlanta in that car that my daughter said, "Dad, I think you're too old to be driving a car like this." We had a great time. The sunroof was popped, and we zipped over to Atlanta, and we drove into the governor's mansion, and we walked in, and we were all dressed up in our nice Sunday clothes, her in a gown and me in my suit and tie, and we got to meet the governor and other valedictorians and got our photo taken. Well, you know, the schoolgirl in this story I'm talking about today, she didn't zip over to the governor's mansion in a shiny blue sports car with her parents. In fact, they didn't zip over in a car at all. They didn't own a car. Remember? They were Methodist pastor poor. They took the city bus over to the governor's mansion. And this schoolgirl said when that city bus rolled up in front of the governor's mansion, she was quite taken by the beauty of this mansion. The landscaping was lovely, and this wrought iron fence around the mansion looked beautiful. She was a little bit intimidated, but not so intimidated she wasn't going to go and meet the governor. So when her and her parents exited the bus and they started walking up the driveway, she noticed that the gatekeeper eyed them in a peculiar sort of way. The gatekeeper at the governor's mansion looked at them, and then he lifted his head over their heads and saw the city bus that they'd just arrived on. And she said it was like the gatekeeper was forming a kind of narrative in his head about someone who's riding on a city bus, somebody who's using public transportation to come to the governor's mansion. And so by the time they got near to the gatekeeper, he was already waving them off, saying, folks, this is a private event here today. You all don't belong here." Well, you can imagine how hurt and how frustrated they all might have been. Her father defended her and said to the gatekeeper, "Listen, today is the day my daughter's going to meet the governor. This is the day that valedictorians get to meet the governor. She's on your list." Well, that gatekeeper, maybe by choice or maybe unintentionally, maybe because the narrative he'd already formed about people who ride city transit in Atlanta, he didn't even look at the list. He said, "Folks, you're not on this list. This is not a day for you." Well, this schoolgirl said that her daddy was not a pastor yet. He was just studying to be a pastor. So he acted a little less like a pastor and a little more like someone who was just studying to be a pastor. He tore up one side of that fella and then tore down the other side and said, "You better check that list, sir, and my daughter's name better be on that list." And the man begrudgingly looked at the list, and he went up and down the list to see if the name was on there. And sure enough, that schoolgirl's name was on the list. She was a valedictorian who'd been invited to the governor's mansion. Well, that gatekeeper said, "Well, I guess she's here. I guess I have to let you in." And he pushed that gate open, still begrudgingly, because he was still living in this old narrative about somebody who takes city transit, and he let them pass. Now, that schoolgirl's all grown up today, and that schoolgirl said she doesn't remember all that much about meeting the governor that day, but she does remember one thing. she remembers making a promise that day. A promise that one day she'd be back. And she'd be the person who would decide who gets to come through the gates. She said one day she would be back and she'd make sure that gate opened much, much wider than ever before, so that the least of these among us would have access to opportunity and power in this world. Now, if y'all from Georgia, you may know who I'm talking about right now. If you're from Georgia, you may know that I'm talking about Stacey Abrams. And you may know, and you may not, if you're not from Georgia, know that she made a run for governor just about a year ago. She wanted to be in the governor's mansion and decide who got to come through that gate and who didn't. And you may know that Stacey Abrams lost to Governor Kemp in her bid for the governor of the great state of Georgia. But I want to tell you, for 10 years before she ran for governor, she served as a representative to the state of Georgia's House of Representatives, fighting for the underdog, keeping her shoulder pressed up against the gate, trying to keep it open so that challenged folks and minority folks, Latinas, Latinos, African Americans, people with disabilities, mental and physical, could enter and have access to the same kind of opportunities and power that we have and enjoy here in the great state of Georgia. Now, lest you be thinking about turning off the Facebook stream here right now, I want to caution you. I'm not telling you the story of Stacey Abrams because I want to be political here. I'm not telling you her story because I want to be partisan here. I'm not telling you the story because I want to be controversial, because let me tell you, those are three things we've got far too much of in this country right now. Three things that are keeping us divided from one another. I'm telling you the story of Stacey Abrams for two reasons. First, I want you to know, I want you to be aware. It's my job as the shepherd of this congregation to remind you that there are people in this world who wittingly or unwittingly, intentionally or unintentionally, are trying to close the gate that Jesus once opened for all of us. There are people who, by the narratives they form about one another, accidentally or intentionally are trying to close the gate. And it's our job, it's the second reason I'm telling you this story, it's our job to keep our shoulders pressed up against those gates lest someone come along and shut them up again. Listen, Jesus opened the gate for all of us. Jesus lived in a day and age where not everybody got to go through the gates. You know, when the psalm says, "Open to me the gates of the Lord that I might enter in righteousness," not everybody got to enter in. If you were a woman, you didn't get to enter in. If you were a child, you didn't get to enter in. If you were someone of a different nationhood, you didn't get to enter in. If you were someone with a physical disability, you didn't get to enter in. If you had a mental disability, you didn't get to enter in. There are so many people who are standing outside of the gates of God's grace, standing outside of the gates toward the life abundant that only Jesus could offer. And Jesus paid the price of his life to open that gate, laid himself down in the middle of that gate so that all his followers could enter in and know the life and life abundant through him, the gate. And for 2,000 years, people have been trying to close that gate over and over again. It's so important that we are awake to those who want to close the gate, and that we are awake to our call as Christians to keep that gate open, lest someone come along and wrap chains around it again and lock it with a deadbolt so people can't enter in any longer. Now, not all of you are from the Montgomery Presbyterian Church. Some of you are watching online today. And I want to tell you just how special this congregation is. In fact, it's one of the reasons I felt called back to be with these good folks. See, this is a church that understands its role and its responsibility to keep that gate open for others. It reminds me, in fact, many ways of my roots in the United Church of Canada, another church whose role it has been is to open the gates wide so that all might enter in and know the abundant life in Jesus Christ. And they've done it even when times were challenging. They opened the gates here at Montgomery for the least among us, whether they drive a shiny blue sports car, or whether they arrive on a city bus, or they arrive on a bicycle or a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Their doors have been opened wide, a reminder of the gates that have been opened to them and to all of us. In fact, I remember at a time long before our Supreme Court ruled on same-sex marriage and all that, when this church got challenged a little bit, at least one person. There was a very dear person in this congregation, Miss Nancy. She was my Savannah mama. Nancy Stevens, so sadly has passed away since then. Nancy was the person who gathered up the friendship pads that we have people sign in every week. And I remember one day I was in my office, and Miss Nancy came into my office, and she said, "Dr. Mark, I noticed on the friendship pad these two women and a little girl signed in as visitors. And I sent them a card to say, welcome, I'm glad you came. And they came back this past Sunday again, and they signed in again." And she said, I noticed they still have the same address. What's that all about?" And I said, "Oh, well, that's Diane and Kathy," not their real names. I said, "That's Diane and Kathy. Those are friends of Beth's and mine, and we invited them because we knew they would find welcome here at Montgomery Presbyterian Church, where there are many churches they might not have back in the early 2000s. And I said, "They have the same address because they live together." And Nancy said, "Oh." And then without skipping a beat, she went, "Oh," as if she understood. And then she took a deep breath and she said, "Dr. Mark, I have to tell you, I know you and your generation may have this all figured out, but for me and my generation, we're still struggling with this." And I said, "Miss Nancy, first of all, I'm not so sure my generation has this all figured out. We're struggling day by day to understand but keep the gates open here at Montgomery, to keep the doors open wide. And if we're ever going to make a mistake," I said, "I pray that we always err on the side of grace rather than the side of judgment." But I said, more importantly, thank you. I need to thank you because you're being honest with me and open with me, so that we can have a conversation about the struggles and what could be divisive but isn't, because we're talking about it. It's one of the best things about belonging to a church is you belong to a community of faith where you can meet, whether online or in person, in the abundance of God's grace. And you can work through these things together, and you can move toward God's grace together. I said, "Nancy, you know, there are churches where there are people who would see someone like Diane and Kathy signing in on the visitor pad. And what they'd do is not say anything to the pastor. They'd go about creating rumors and gossip about Diane and Kathy. And they'd be hurtful, and they'd politicize Diane and Kathy's relationship, and they'd try to destroy them, or worse, they'd try to destroy the pastor for welcoming them, for being too liberal." Where have we heard that before? Well, let me tell you, Diane and Kathy came the next Sunday. And I said, "Miss Nancy, I see they came back." She said, "Yeah, I went home and I wrote them another card and told them how much they'd be welcome here at MPC." And then she said, "I wrote them another card. Then I'm going to write them another card this Sunday too." And Diane and Kathy came back the next week and the next week and the next week, and eventually they joined the church. And their little girl was baptized right here at Montgomery Presbyterian Church, and the congregation's faces were a mix of smiles and tears of joy. For one of those lost sheep, in fact, 3 of them, had found their way home through the gate of God's grace. Friends, it's our call in this day and age especially to keep our shoulders pressed up against the gate, to hold them open and hold them open wide so that the least among us might find access to the grace of God. It's our job to hold those gates open so that nobody can come along and undo what Jesus has done for all of us 2,000 years ago. Now, I began this message by asking you a simple question. What does the voice of the Good Shepherd sound like to you this day? Is it the voice of comfort? Is it the voice of purpose and conviction? Is it the voice of a gate that's creaking open wide to grant you access to God's grace and God's blessings too, that you might find rest and safety and then go back into the world in good pasture and know the abundant life in Jesus Christ? I want to tell you, a number of years ago, 1992, I was elected to be a delegate to the General Council of the United Church of Canada. That's like the General Assembly for us Presbyterians. We met out in New Brunswick, and there was so much politics going on. You wouldn't believe it. When they talk about church politics, you want to see it go on to a General Council or General Assembly meeting. People would stay up late in committee meetings and they'd try and strong-arm others and lobby each other, try to get them vote this way or that way on church policy. And in the mornings when we gathered in the arena, maybe 600 or 700 of us, gathering to go about the business of the court, of the General Council for the day, people continued lobbying each other. They were buzzing and they were conflicted. And over on one side of the arena there was drama. On the other side there might be drama. There was all sorts of buzzing and lobbying going on, and this energy, lot of conflict and chaos. You could hardly believe it was the body of Jesus Christ gathering to do the work of the church. But I remember that at that General Council, we began each day with worship. And the worship leaders began the worship service not by walking up on the stage and banging on the microphone saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, would you please take your seats? Please come to order. We're about to worship the Lord now." There was none of that. One worship leader just walked up to the microphone amidst all that chaos and that frenetic energy in the arena, walked up to the microphone and very quietly started singing the words of Psalm 46:10. Be still, be still, be still and know that I am Lord. For I am exalted in the nations and on earth. Be still and know that I am God. And one by one, people started to settle down. They quieted and went to their seats all on their own. And as the worship leaders sang it again, people started joining in until the full body of Christ, the whole church, was singing it together. Be still. Be still, be still and know that I am God, for I am exalted in the nations and on earth. Be still and know that I am God. Friends, there are people in this world who wittingly or unwittingly, intentionally or even unintentionally, are attempting to close the gates which Jesus opened 2,000 years ago for you, for me, and for all of his sheep, that they might go in and find safety, they might go out and enjoy pasture, and that they might know the life abundant in Jesus Christ. I believe it's when we listen for the voice of the Good Shepherd together, when we come together as Christ's people, Christ's flock, as the body of Jesus Christ in the here and now, that we start to hear him. And we're able to live more faithfully even in the challenging times in which we do. I want to invite you this week to find some time to be still and listen for God's voice. I don't mean be still and be filled with anxiety and stress about the days. I mean be still from that. Be still the anxiety and the stress of these uncertain times. I don't mean be still and still be filled with an empty heart longing for meaning and purpose. No. And I don't mean be still with your anger and your frustration about gates that have been closed in your way. No, I mean simply empty yourself and be still. Be still and listen for the voice of the Good Shepherd, who is the gate and allows you to enter into his love and nourishes you and comforts you and strengthens you, that you might be renewed and that you too might know the abundant life in Jesus Christ. Praise be to God. Amen. Let us pray.